The odds are you have fewer friends at this age than your parents did, and probably fewer friends than you yourself had just a few years ago. This time on Poll Hub, the American Fall of Friendships. A big new study shows what's happening and tries to look at why. We're talking with the author. And then Lee's fun fact is perfectly timed for the last couple of days of the Olympics. What do you think it is? Yeah, happy August, everybody. Let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper.
And I'm Mary Griffith, sitting in for Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Lee Miringoff.
And Lee, in case his sound gets a little iffy at times, had to be on the road for this podcast today. So Lee is on a connection on a cell phone. So he sounds pretty good when he's here, and hopefully he'll stay for the whole show. So I just want to let everybody know that, Lee. So as we said in the open, Americans and friendship are something that is a difficult thing right now. Part of that is COVID, but there's been a lot of research over the last few years about the number of close friendships Americans have and how that manifests itself in everything from our politics to our health, all kinds of different things. And there's a brand new survey out that we found really interesting. In fact, I think it popped into my email box one morning and I turned it around to the team like at 7 o'clock in the morning going, you got to read this. It's called The State of American Friendship, Change, Challenges, and Loss from the Survey Center on American Life at AEI, American Enterprise Institute. And the author, Dan Cox is with us. Dan, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't you give us a real quick kind of gist of what you found in terms of friendships and Americans and you know the findings that you had. And then I'd love to dive in to what it means to the extent that we can figure that out.
Yeah, so this is a long interest for me, like understanding social dynamics, the way our politics and personal lives can be structured by the people around us. Previously, about a year ago, we conducted a big survey on American social networks, getting a sense of just understanding who we know and how that impacts our life. And so this survey, coming out of the pandemic, and we're going to be coming out for a good long time, it seems like, but we wanted to get a sense of to what extent we're seeing really significant changes in the structure and the form of American friendships. And one of the things that was really interesting is there haven't been a lot of polls out there that at least I ran across that was solely focused on this topic. We had to go back a couple decades, in fact, to find something that was exclusively about friendship. And it's not an easy thing to pull on, right? There's a number of different ways you can talk about friendship. You can define it, and so we did ran through a couple different basic forms of friendship. Do you have a close friend? Do you have a best friend? And one of the patterns that emerged really early on that we weren't really looking for, but just was unavoidable, was that American friendship circles seemed to be contracting.
And what are some of the reasons, Dan, why those circles have been getting smaller?
Yeah, so there's two things here. So this is sort of a two-part answer to a one-part question. The first thing we found is that men seem to be suffering disproportionately. So in terms of losing a best friend, fewer men have a best friend now. They have a fewer number of close friends, and they're less likely to rely on their friends than in the past. And there's a number of structural reasons that I think this is the case. And one of the things I'm also doing is talking about the role that masculinity and sort of traditional notions of masculinity are playing as well. But I think we also need to focus on some of the structural components. So for men in particular, but Americans overall, we're seeing a decline in religious attendance and religious engagement. And that has been a really important, so it still is, but it was a really important source of social connection for a lot of Americans. And so I think as you see people drawing back from that a little bit, it's showing up in other ways in terms of the size and robustness of American social networks. Americans are marrying later. Again, men a little bit marrying even a little bit later than women, which has been pretty consistent. And we know that married folks tend to have more robust social circles than people who are single. And I think those ideas are often put in opposition to each other, right? Like friendship and marriage. People who are married, then they lose some friendships because they prioritize their partner or their spouse. But we actually see the opposite, right? That people who have a spouse or partner tend to have a larger slate of friends to rely on. And then the last thing that we looked at, and what I've looked at in this research, is the way that employment influences our social networks. One of the really interesting things that we found in the poll was that the workplace is the most common way for people to make close friends. And we know that over the past decade or so, men, particularly young men, have disproportionately left the workforce due to a variety of different economic reasons.
Yeah, one of the things, Dan, that I find interesting is that you talked about the relationship of marriage and friendship. But the old saying is it's better to start a relationship if you have a good friend, and that then evolves into a relationship. But if we're having fewer friends, then maybe we're having fewer marriages because we have fewer friends. I don't know. I just wanted to throw that in. I didn't know if you had a reaction to that.
Yeah, well, we know that men and women also tend to think about marriage a little bit differently. And one of the things we found is that men were husbands are more likely to rely on their spouses for emotional support than women. Women tend to have more robust social support. And even if they are married, a significant number actually, when they have a problem, will go to someone outside their marriage. So they'll have a friend or a partner or someone that is not their spouse, and they'll rely on them to receive emotional support, and that just, it helps so much, because when you have multiple people you can rely on, you don't have to put everything on that one person, right? Like if that person's not available, or you're having problems with that person, you have a whole bunch of people in your roster that you can lean on and support.
How much does this have to do with COVID? When everything contracted, right? We're locked in our houses, and the only way we see friends is like we're doing this podcast right now in Zoom or FaceTime or something. How much do you think it has to do with COVID?
Well, ironically, I think very little when you think about the medium to long term. I think short term, yeah, we all kind of hunkered down, and we weren't seeing, particularly our friends and people we didn't live with very often. But when you think about the long-term implications, I think one of the things that COVID will do is make us realize how important friendships are. They've always been important, but I think they've been de-emphasized in a way that's been unhelpful, right? Like when you think about the how we talk about living a good and rewarding life, friendship is kind of a footnote. We talk about getting a good job that has meaning, contributing to your society, contributing to community, starting a family, getting married. These are the things that the narratives that we tell ourselves are important, and we tell our kids are important. And yet friendship really, really matters, and it matters throughout your entire life. It doesn't just matter when you're young. There's been studies that show that for seniors, actually, it's a relationship with friends, not family members, that actually determines how happy they are.
And Dan, I found really interesting in the study talking about a best friend and the proportion of Americans who tend to have one best friend. For me, I always thought of that term best friend from when I was maybe in high school or maybe college, and now I have like a small circle of close friends. So talk to us a little bit about that whole concept and where that fits into the overall idea of friendship in America.
Yeah, so we didn't do anything other, it was a very simple question we replicated from Gallup, and it was just like, do you have someone you consider your best friend or not? And the number of people who have a best friend has declined. And again, men seem to be bearing this disproportionate burden there. But we also asked folks, what about this person who had a best friend? What about this person makes them your best friend? And they could say anything they wanted. And there were two themes that emerged from that, longevity and consistency. So people who had a best friend tended to know this person for a very long time. Often this was a childhood friend. And the other thing that we heard in the responses was that these people tended to be available, right? They were always there for them, no matter the time or what was going on in their life. These people would offer sort of non-judgmental support, and so that came through. Those two traits seem to be essential for a best friend.
And I assume that all the mobility of our society over the decades has strained the opportunity people just have, COVID notwithstanding, but just to get together. If you have folks who are friends and for jobs or other reasons just move a great distance, it's got to make that frequency of contact a little bit more complicated, more difficult.
Yeah, and again, I think this shows the particular challenge to maintain kind of activity friendships, and that's a kind of friendship that men are actually more likely to do than women. So when you go to a game with, go out to a bar, go golfing with, These are kind of traditionally masculine activities, but it could be, going to a museum, sitting at a cafe, right? It's really hard to do that if your friend lives in a different city or across the country. And so those kind of friendships, I think, are they can be a little bit weaker and prone to sort of the ebbs and flows of life. And for women who I think value more or just more comfortable with the kind of just one-on-one emotional engagement with their friends, just having a long conversation, you can still do that relatively easily, over the phone, on Zoom. And I think that's one of the reasons that we need to think about sort of adapting what we think about male and female friendships. In fact, both men and women really benefit from having these intimate, close connections. In the poll, we asked about prevalence of experiencing loneliness or isolation, depression or anxiety, and we also included a bunch of questions about how emotionally intimate or connected you feel to your friend. Women, on general, were much more emotionally connected with their friends, and people who had those kind of emotional connections were far less likely to feel lonely, anxious, or depressed, regardless of whether they are married or how many friends they had. Those kind of close connections really, really were important. And so this idea that men and women have different types of friendships or need different things, I think is just not borne out in this data, at least.
Your report has sparked a lot of additional commentary all over the map. And one that stood out to me was in a publication called The Week. Damon Linker wrote about loneliness and tied it to some of the kind of authoritarian politics, the appeal of authoritarian politics that we're seeing. I don't know if you read that, and I don't know if this is something you guys have thought about, but it does strike me when I read through that it does perhaps provide some explanation for the moment that we find ourselves in politically, which is a very different moment than we've been in the U.S. For a very long time.
Yeah, and there's been a few writers and other folks in the media who sort of like trying to trace the connection between, like, okay, we're seeing something here that's happening with our connection to community and connection to each other, and how might that help explain the direction of our politics recently, including grappling with authoritarian ideas and leadership. And I think there's something there for sure. To the extent that you feel invested in your community, invested in the political system, you're more inclined to go through sort of traditional means to make change, to affect change. And where to the extent that you feel alienated and isolated, you're far more likely to listen to someone who sort of saying, hey, you're getting given a rotten deal here and you can't trust the system, so you got to go outside. I'm the only person who can fix it, right? Those are very kind of Trumpian ideas. And so I think that's right. If we're not invested in each other, if we're not invested in our communities around us, it becomes a lot easier for our politics to move in very dangerous directions.
Yeah, and I thought it was really fascinating. What struck me is just that people, and I can't say I'm surprised by this, but that people who actually end friendships right now because of political disagreements, which can cover a whole wide range of things, from the health of our democracy to whether you get vaccinated or not. And here, not only do you find a significant number of people who are in that group, but that Democrats are twice as likely as Republicans are to draw the line in the sand, as it were, when it comes to politics and friendships. That part I found interesting.
Yeah, and that's pretty consistent too, right? So if you look across polling, like, it's Democrats or liberals, and particularly liberal women, are most likely to sort of say, political differences can be a deal breaker for a relationship or a friendship. And I think what it comes down to is different ways of thinking about politics and what it means. We did a bunch of follow-up interviews with folks who said, like, this was a deal breaker in a few of our polls. And what we heard again and again is it's not just about like politics, Republican versus Democrat. It's about worldview. It's about, it's about vaccines, right? Politics becomes a little more encompassing than just, issue A or issue B and whatever policy or infrastructure bill, right? We're wrangling over. And so I think it's just like a different perception of what politics is And so I think that's why you see some of that discrepancy, but it's really consistent across a number of polls that people on the left are far more likely to sort of say it's a deal breaker than people on the right.
Well, Dan, this is certainly a fascinating study, and we're glad to have you here with us today. Dan Cox, Director of the Survey Center on American Life and a Senior Fellow in Polling and Public Opinion at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, I certainly enjoyed that discussion, but my favorite segment every week is when I get a chance to talk about my fun fact. And the Olympics clearly in full swing right now. And we took a look back at an SSRS omnibus survey, which was done in 2018, to see what type of thing in terms of coverage people like the most. And I'm curious to have you guys join in on this. Number one at 58% were the actual sporting events. The opening ceremonies at 19, and then it falls down to the medal ceremonies and the closing ceremonies. But clearly, it's all about the events, and the opening ceremonies are something that sort of gets the ball rolling. Are you guys Olympic viewer fans?
I used to be a lot more than I am now. For me, I always like the events, but it depends on which events. So for the Summer Olympics, it was always gymnastics and diving and sometimes swimming. And for winter, it was always figure skating and sometimes, ski jumping or something like that. But it's really specific to which events we're talking about. And then my fallback is always the opening ceremonies, just because of the pageantry, and you never know, sort of what was going to take place.
Look, I came of age as a kid when the televised Olympics became a different thing. ABC with their close and personal on the athletes really changed the game. I mean, NBC's had the Olympics for a long time, but ABC had them in the 70s and late 60s and 70s from Mexico City on, and really changed what the Olympics meant. So yeah, we watched, they were events in our household. They were events as big as Roots or any of the other big shows from the 70s where everybody watched. I can't say that I've watched any Olympics in probably 10, 15 years at all, other than seeing clips. So I see clips in my, in my feeds or whatever. And I did watch, but the funny thing is they show opening ceremonies on here at 20% or 19%, 1 in 5, that's their favorite. I have watched the opening ceremonies on a stream for the crazy pageantry. They're so different than when I was a kid watching the Olympics. It was all quite simple. Now there are these incredible shows with waves of drones and lasers and lights and millions of people and pyrotechnics. I mean, they're a real spectacle. So I can see why 1 in 5 basically say, yeah, it's the opening ceremonies. I get that.
Yeah, I loved I go back to the Muhammad Ali lighting the torch, and I thought that was really special. What's really weird, and we can sort of close with this, is I haven't watched 1 minute this year, and I'm trying to understand why. And I think it has to do with just the turnover of the stars. They've made it into such a celebrity event, and I haven't kept up enough. So obviously, the whole thing with the gymnastics, discussion, that I found, interesting and humanizing in a lot of ways. But I haven't gotten into the events. I usually start and then I kind of get in little by little. And this year, for some reason, I just haven't been there. And, I don't know what that's about, but I just haven't kind of connected. So, to each his own.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. I'm Mary Griffith, and Poll Hub's executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor. Ashley Marcinek is our production assistant, and Marcello Bettman is our trusted editor. Thanks to the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University. They provide us with the ability to look back at survey questions and results over the decades. If you have questions or comments, reach out to us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter and Marist Poll on Facebook and Instagram. And while you're at it, check out our free series of short online learning modules. The Marist Poll Academy can be found on maristpoll.com. Finally, if you like what you hear on Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review on your podcasting app of choice. Positive reviews help others find us. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you back here next week.